In the heart of Florida's bustling tourist district, nestled between flashing neon signs and crowded boardwalks, there sat a small cafe called the Sunset Grill. The cafe had become a landmark for locals and tourists alike. Its charming facade painted a soft yellow with vibrant green shutters, like something straight out of a postcard. The inviting appearance matched the atmosphere inside, a relaxed, laid-back vibe that welcomed both families from out of town and residents who had spent years calling the town home. Inside, the scent of fresh seafood lingered in the air, with the cafe's signature dish being its famous seafood chowder, a rich, creamy blend of ocean flavors that had drawn people from all over. For many tourists, it was the perfect place to pass the hours away, sipping iced tea on the outdoor patio and gazing out over the sparkling waves of the Atlantic Ocean. The rhythmic sound of the water lapping against the shore became the background music to countless conversations, the gentle breeze ruffling the palm trees lining the beach. The town itself, small but full of life, was known for its coastal charm. Its residents moved at a pace slower than the larger cities to the north, where time was a constant chase. Here, people greeted each other by name, exchanged pleasantries at the grocery store, and the streets felt less like a maze of tourist traps and more like a community. It was a place where everyone knew everyone's business, where the problems were small and the days seemed long, stretching out lazily under the warm Florida sun. To outsiders, it appeared like paradise, a small town caught in the glow of endless summer. But beneath the idyllic exterior, there was an undercurrent of tension, a storm brewing quietly, unnoticed by most. And at the center of it all was Mark Jennings, a 17-year-old waiter who had come to work at the Sunset Grill in the summer after his 16th birthday. For Mark, this job was more than just a way to make a little extra cash. It was his first taste of independence. It was his chance to step outside the suffocating walls of his small apartment, where the weight of his home life pressed down on him like an invisible hand. Mark was proud of his job. He didn't mind the long hours, the constant movement, or the endless cycle of tables to wait on. He was good at it, efficient, polite, and always just the right amount of friendly. But there was a distance to him that set him apart from the other staff. The other waiters often joked that he was quiet as a shadow, never engaging in conversations beyond the necessary pleasantries. He was the kind of person who kept to himself, who did what was asked of him and no more. He moved quickly, served orders swiftly, and when his shift ended, he disappeared just as easily as he had arrived. There were no close friendships formed in the cafe, only casual nods, polite exchanges, and the same faces coming and going. Mark didn't need much else, or so it seemed. He lived with his mother, Linda, in a small, modest apartment a few blocks away. The apartment had seen better days. Its walls were worn with age, the carpet threadbare in places, and the windows always slightly fogged from the humidity that crept in from the outside. Linda did her best to keep things together, but she was often distracted, worn thin by her own struggles. Mark's father had been absent for most of his life, leaving Linda to raise Mark alone. There were no warm father-son moments or family dinners shared around a table. His father's absence was something unspoken, a void that Mark carried with him wherever he went. He didn't know his father's name, had never asked, and when his mother occasionally mentioned his father, it was in hushed tones, like a bitter memory best left untouched. Mark never asked for more, but the quiet ache of abandonment was always there, lurking at the edges of his mind. While Mark appeared calm on the outside, something was slowly beginning to unravel inside. The weight of his fragmented home life, combined with the pressures of adolescence, was starting to create a dangerous mix. It wasn't just the lack of a father figure. It was the constant sense of being overlooked, ignored, and misunderstood. At school, he was the quiet kid who sat at the back of the classroom, never drawing attention to himself, never making waves. He didn't seek out friends, didn't look for validation in the popularity contests that so many other teens seemed to crave. He had never been one to talk about his feelings, his thoughts, or the growing sense of isolation that took root in him each day. Instead, he buried it deep, tucked it away, and focused on the small things he could control, like his work at the cafe, where no one asked too many questions. As the days passed, the emotional pressure began to mount. Mark found solace in the rhythmic monotony of his work. The cafe, though filled with bustling tourists, provided him with a sense of order. The act of serving food, clearing plates, and taking orders became a routine, a pattern that offered a brief escape from the chaos that swirled inside him. But at night, when the cafe closed and the world outside grew quieter, Mark couldn't silence the gnawing feeling that something was wrong, that something was missing. He knew he was lost. He knew he was drowning in a sea of emotions he didn't understand. He tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the small things, the way the glass was always just so when he set it on the table, the satisfaction of a job well done, but in the dark corners of his mind, a storm was brewing. A storm he wasn't prepared to face. Mark's internal struggle didn't go unnoticed by his mother. Linda, worn out by her own burdens, often stared at him with a mixture of worry and helplessness. She tried to talk to him, to offer comfort, but Mark shut her out. He didn't want her pity. He didn't want anyone's sympathy. Instead, he withdrew further into himself, seeking refuge in the emptiness he'd created. The pressure of his life, the weight of his frustrations, the seething anger he couldn't let out began to manifest in ways he couldn't control. It was only a matter of time before it would all come crashing down. What Mark didn't know, what no one could have predicted, was that the darkness inside him had reached a tipping point, and when the fuse finally lit, it would ignite a chain of events that would change everything. It was a small, seemingly insignificant thing that pushed him over the edge, a comment, a glance, a moment of frustration. But for Mark, it was the spark that would set everything into motion. He had felt ignored by the world for so long, and now, the cafe, this place where he'd spent countless hours working, would become the stage for something far darker than anyone could have imagined. The storm that had been quietly brewing in the heart of Florida's tourist district was about to break wide open. It was the afternoon of June 18th when Mark's plan began to take shape. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the busy tourist district in Florida, where the Sunset Grill sat nestled between other lively attractions. As usual, the cafe was filled with the steady hum of activity, tourists and locals alike mingling, exchanging stories over iced drinks and shrimp cocktails. Mark moved through the crowd with practiced ease, delivering orders to tables, taking payments, and making small talk with regular customers. The cafe, with its wooden tables and nautical decor, was a place of comfort and routine. But as Mark weaved through the rows of tables, something began to stir inside him, like a slow crack spreading through glass. The constant buzz of conversation, the soft clinking of glasses and plates, became almost unbearable. Every word he heard seemed to grind against his nerves, every laugh like a sharp knife, slicing through the thin veneer of composure he had been holding onto for so long. Beneath his polite demeanor, the quiet, simmering anger that had been building inside him for months was beginning to claw its way out. He had learned long ago to bury it deep inside, to smile when he didn't want to nod and move on when he was ignored or belittled. But today, the mask was starting to crack. Mark had never been a loud person. He had always kept to himself, fading into the background, his existence barely noticeable to the people around him. He'd accepted that, in a way. But something had shifted over the past few weeks. The loneliness that he had grown so accustomed to had turned into resentment, and that resentment had transformed into something far darker. Something he couldn't contain anymore. As he moved through the cafe, he watched the people around him, their carefree laughter, the way they leaned in close to share a private joke, the comfort they found in each other's presence. He hated them for it. He hated how easy everything seemed for them, how effortlessly they moved through life, while he stood on the sidelines, forgotten, invisible. Around 3 p.m., Mark excused himself from the main dining area. His shift had been going on for hours, and he was starting to feel the weight of the plan he had been formulating for days. The kitchen was quieter, the noise muffled by the thick walls. He walked into the small storage room at the back of the cafe, where the cleaning supplies were kept and the extra chairs were stored. It was here that he had hidden the guns, 2 handguns he had taken from his mother's boyfriend without his knowledge. Mark had watched him leave them on the counter after a night of drinking, the weapons carelessly left in plain sight. He hadn't hesitated for a moment. The guns were his now, and he knew exactly what he would do with them. The small, dimly lit storage room felt different to Mark now. It was no longer a place to store extra napkins or boxes of tea bags. It was a sanctuary, a place of escape where he could be alone with his thoughts, where he could prepare for what was coming. He had planned everything down to the smallest detail. He knew where the tables were, which ones were close to the exits, and which ones would be the most difficult to reach. He'd watched the customers carefully, memorizing the patterns of their movement, noting who would be sitting where and when. He'd even timed the restaurant's busiest moments, calculating the precise moment when chaos would begin. He knew the cafe like the back of his hand, and today he would turn that knowledge into something terrible. Mark took the guns from their hiding place, feeling their cold weight in his hands. He checked the magazines, ensuring they were fully loaded. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his movements were deliberate, calm. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't scared. He had already crossed the line, and there was no going back. He had spent so long imagining this moment, planning, rehearsing in his mind what he would do, how he would do it. Now it was time to act. The tension that had been building inside him, that tight knot in his stomach, began to loosen as he stepped out of the storage room and into the kitchen. No one suspected a thing. He didn't look like a threat. He didn't seem like a person capable of something so horrific. To the other waiters, he was just Mark, the quiet one, the kid who always kept his head down and did his job. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand out. To them, he was just another face in the crowd. That was part of the plan. He needed to blend in. He needed to be unnoticed, to have the element of surprise on his side. No one in the cafe that day, not a single person, had any idea what Mark had become or what he was about to do. As he stepped back into the dining area, he kept his eyes down. He made his way toward the bar, delivering drinks to a table near the window. The customers smiled and thanked him, oblivious to the fact that he was no longer the person they thought he was. Mark didn't speak to anyone. He didn't make eye contact. He just moved through the space, the guns hidden beneath his apron, his heartbeat steady, his mind focused. He was a waiter, but today he was also something much darker, something that had been growing inside him for months, and the time had finally come to let it out. The cafe, full of life and laughter, would soon become a place of horror, but Mark didn't think about that. All he could focus on was the quiet hum of the restaurant, the steady rhythm of the orders coming in, the plates being cleared, the mundane, everyday motions of the cafe that he had come to hate. He was ready. He had thought it all through, every step of the way. He knew what he had to do, and no one could stop him now. No one knew, as Mark moved through the crowded cafe, that this was the last time anyone would enjoy a meal here in peace. In a few moments, everything would change. The calm would be shattered, the quiet would be broken, and Mark Jennings would make sure that nothing in the Sunset Grill would ever be the same again. Mark returned to the main floor, his demeanor completely unchanged. There was no sign of the storm that had been building inside him for months. He moved through the bustling cafe with the same practiced ease he always had, delivering plates of food, exchanging pleasantries with familiar faces, and offering the same forced smile he had worn since his first day on the job. He served a couple at table 5, asking if they needed any refills and nodding when they mentioned how much they enjoyed the seafood chowder. To anyone watching, he was just another waiter, doing his job, nothing more, nothing less. He moved toward the kitchen to grab a new round of drinks, gliding past the other waiters, each of them lost in their own tasks, oblivious to the fact that they were about to be swept into something far darker than they could imagine. The cafe was busy as usual. The air was filled with the sounds of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the hum of casual conversation. The tourists at the tables near the windows were chatting, their attention diverted by the view of the ocean beyond. The regulars sat at their usual spots at the bar, chatting with the bartender, sipping their drinks slowly, savoring the warm, easy atmosphere of the place. Mark walked past them, offering a nod or a brief smile, but his mind was elsewhere. His heart beat steadily in his chest, a quiet rhythm that matched the pace of his movements. He was calm. He was still. But in his mind, the storm raged. Mark walked behind the bar, where a fresh batch of drinks was waiting to be served. He stood there for a moment, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of the gun tucked under his apron. The weight of it was comforting in its own way. Something solid, something real in a world that had always felt too unpredictable, too chaotic. The gun was heavy, but it gave him a sense of control. It was the only thing in his life that had ever felt like it was truly his. The rest, His job, his interactions with people, his life had always been out of his reach, like a script he couldn't quite follow. But the gun? The gun was something he could hold, something he could use. And in that moment, it became the only thing that mattered. He could hear the chatter continuing, the sound of plates being cleared, the laughter rising and falling as the cafe buzzed with life. But none of it mattered to him now. None of it was real. His focus sharpened as he stood there, feeling the cool steel of the weapon against his skin, his fingers tightening around the grip. He was no longer a waiter. He was something else entirely. Something that could no longer be Without warning, Mark pulled the weapon from his waist and fired it into the air. The loud bang shattered the peaceful hum of the cafe, cutting through the noise like a knife. The sound echoed off the walls, sending a wave of shock and confusion rippling through the room. The diners froze for a split second, staring wide-eyed at the source of the noise, before panic set in. People screamed. The peaceful atmosphere was shattered, replaced by chaos as the realization hit them. This was not a joke. This was real. Mark didn't wait for anyone to react. He didn't hesitate. He turned the gun on the patrons closest to him, firing quickly, methodically. The shots rang out in rapid succession, each one louder than the last, drowning out the screams of the people around him. The cafe erupted into pandemonium as people scrambled to escape, diving under tables, knocking over chairs, pushing their way toward the doors. But it was already too late. Mark had taken control of the situation. The exits were blocked. There was no escape. The first 5 seconds felt like an eternity. In that time, the cafe transformed from a bustling dining spot to a war zone. People screamed, cried out for help, but their pleas were drowned out by the relentless gunfire. The terror was immediate, overwhelming. Those who tried to flee were shot in the back, their desperate attempts to survive cut short by the cold, calculated aim of the shooter. Others never saw it coming, struck down in their seats in the middle of a meal, their lives snuffed out in an instant. Some never even had a chance to move. The silence that had once filled the cafe was replaced by the deafening sound of gunfire and the chaos of people trying to flee. Mark moved through the cafe with precision, each shot calculated, every movement deliberate. He didn't rush. There was no panic in his actions. He was focused, determined, methodical. He fired at anyone who tried to escape, shooting them as they attempted to crawl under tables or dash for the door. The blood began to pool on the floor, mixing with the remnants of the meal that had once filled the space with comfort and warmth. The bright yellow walls, the cheerful decor, the laughter, all of it was now drowned out by the screams, the gunfire, and the silence that followed. The cafe became a slaughterhouse. 36 people were killed that day. Some were shot in the back as they tried to flee, their lives snuffed out in an instant. Others were struck down in their seats, too surprised to react, too unaware of the danger until it was too late. The elderly couple at table 12, the group of teenagers celebrating a birthday, the family with 2 small children, all of them had their lives stolen in the blink of an eye. They were no different from the others who had come in for a meal, expecting nothing more than a quiet afternoon by the sea. But now the cafe was a graveyard, the sounds of life replaced by the echoes of death. The chaos was palpable, but it was the chilling calm with which Mark carried out the massacre that struck the hardest. There was no frantic shouting, no sign of uncertainty. Mark moved through the cafe like a machine, following the plan he had crafted so meticulously in his mind. His eyes were cold, distant, and there was no hint of remorse. In those moments, he had become something other than human. He was a force of nature, unstoppable, merciless, with a single objective in mind: to end it all. The cafe was just the setting, the people, nothing more than obstacles standing in his way. The horror was over in minutes. The gunfire subsided and the cafe fell eerily silent. The bodies of the fallen lay scattered across the room, their lives taken in an instant. Mark stood in the middle of it all, his hands still gripping the gun, his breath steady. He looked around at the carnage he had created, the lives he had destroyed, and for the briefest of moments, he felt nothing. No triumph, no sorrow, no relief, just an empty void where emotions should have been. And then, as quickly as it had started, Mark turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving behind the chaos he had unleashed. The door swung shut behind him, and the silence that followed was deafening. No one could have predicted it. No one could have stopped it. The town would never be the same. Neither would Mark. By the time law enforcement arrived at the scene, Mark Jennings had already fled into the back alley behind the Sunset Grill. The once vibrant cafe, which had served as a beloved gathering spot for locals and tourists alike, was now a scene of pure devastation. Officers pushed their way through the front door, their eyes immediately assaulted by the sight that greeted them. The floor was covered in blood, streaked across the once cleanly tiles like a macabre painting. Tables that had been filled with laughter and chatter only moments before were now overturned, their legs twisted in unnatural directions. Chairs lay scattered, some broken, others abandoned in frantic haste. The walls, once bright and welcoming, now stood splattered with the dark stains of violence. The sound of the officers' boots echoed in the stillness, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder and death. As they moved further into the cafe, they found the bodies. 36 people had been killed. Some were slumped against the walls, their faces frozen in terror. Others sprawled across the floor, their bodies twisted in the chaos of their last moments. The lifeless eyes of victims stared up at the ceiling, unblinking, unaware of the horror that had unfolded so suddenly. The scene was like something out of a nightmare, a massacre carried out in a place that had once symbolized comfort and simplicity. Now it was a testament to the unimaginable darkness that could lie within a person, even someone who had once been so seemingly ordinary. Among the wreckage, the surviving witnesses were being led out by paramedics, their faces pale, eyes wide with shock, their hands trembling as they tried to make sense of what had happened. They had been living their lives, enjoying a meal, a drink, a quiet afternoon when everything changed in the blink of an eye. Now their minds were full of fragmented images. Flashes of gunfire, screams, the frantic dash for safety. Many of them were unable to fully comprehend what they had just witnessed. Some said they saw Mark's face, a young, expressionless face, moving through the chaos like a ghost, as if he were just another part of the cafe's background. To them, he had seemed unremarkable. Others, traumatized beyond words, couldn't remember seeing him at all. Their minds had shut down, unable to process the reality of what was happening. It didn't matter. The destruction was complete. The victims were gone, and the cafe would never be the same. The once vibrant atmosphere had been replaced with silence, a silence so profound that it almost felt suffocating. The police began their investigation, securing the scene and starting their grim task of identifying the bodies and collecting evidence. But they were met with a stark realization. The killer was no longer there. Mark had vanished into the night. Within hours, the news spread across the state of Florida, and soon it reached every corner of the nation. Headlines screamed about the Florida Café massacre, each one more sensational than the last. The story became a topic of nationwide conversation, sparking outrage, disbelief, and confusion. People couldn't comprehend how a teenager barely into adulthood could carry out such a brutal and cold-blooded act. How could someone so young, someone who had worked in a cafe as a waiter, turn into a killer? There were no answers, only questions. Social media exploded with speculation. Users flooded platforms like Twitter and Facebook with theories, trying to make sense of the senseless. Some pointed to Mark's quiet demeanor, suggesting that he had been hiding his true nature for years. Others questioned his home life, wondering if the absence of a father figure and the turmoil within his family had contributed to his violent actions. News outlets churned out story after story, piecing together fragments of Mark's past, trying to uncover a motive, an explanation, something that could make sense of what had happened. But the truth was, no one had any answers. The police had no leads. They couldn't explain why Mark had done it, only that he had planned it all meticulously and carried it out with cold, methodical precision. Authorities launched a manhunt almost immediately, scouring every inch of the city and the surrounding areas. They knew Mark had fled, but they had no idea where he had gone. His disappearance was as sudden and unexpected as the massacre itself. There were no notes left behind, no clues, no indication of where he might be. For 3 days, he became a ghost, slipping through the cracks of the city, evading capture. The police were left to follow dead ends, their efforts frustrated by the lack of evidence and the sheer unpredictability of his movements. The entire city was on edge, afraid to go anywhere alone. afraid that the killer might still be lurking in the shadows. Mark's family, just as confused as the rest of the community, was thrust into the media spotlight. His mother, Linda, was interviewed by reporters, her face pale and stricken with grief. She could barely comprehend what had happened, her mind a whirl of confusion and disbelief. She told the media that Mark had always been a quiet boy, never one to cause trouble. He had been reserved, yes, but not violent. She didn't understand how it had all gone so horribly wrong. She hadn't seen any signs. He had never shown any outward signs of aggression, no violent outbursts, no warning that he was capable of such a horrific act. To her, Mark was just a boy, a teenager still figuring out life, still living under her roof. She couldn't reconcile the Mark she knew with the person who had committed such an atrocity. In the days that followed, Linda became the reluctant face of the tragedy. The media hounded her for answers she didn't have. They wanted to know how she had failed to see the signs, how she had raised a boy who could do something so unfathomable. But Linda had no answers. She was a mother who had lost her child, but not in the way most people would ever expect. She had lost him to something darker than she could ever understand. The manhunt continued for 3 days, but Mark remained a shadow, slipping through the net cast by the police. His disappearance only added to the horror of the massacre. People began to wonder if he would ever be caught, if the town would ever be safe again. The fear that had gripped the community only intensified. People locked their doors at night, avoided crowded places, and whispered about the killer who had slipped away without a trace. But as time passed, the story of the Florida Café massacre faded from the headlines. The manhunt continued, but the questions remained unanswered. Mark Jennings had vanished, and the town of Florida would never be the same again. The café, once a place of comfort and joy, had become a haunting memory, its cheerful atmosphere forever replaced by the shadow of violence and loss. The tragedy left behind scars that would never heal, and for the families of the victims, the search for answers would go on long after Mark's name had faded from the headlines. It wasn't until 3 days later that Mark Jennings was found. He had vanished into the night, slipping through the cracks of Florida's bustling streets, evading the police with an eerie calmness. For 3 days, Mark remained a ghost, a shadow drifting from place to place, eluding capture with the same quiet intensity that had defined his life up until that point. The city was on edge, the news constantly flashing updates on the manhunt, but no one had seen him. His disappearance felt almost deliberate, as if he had anticipated every move the authorities would make. Then, a tip came in. A local motel on the outskirts of town reported a suspicious guest. Mark was hiding there, alone in a rundown room, his face pale and gaunt. When the police officers stormed the motel room, they found him sitting on the bed, his hands trembling slightly, eyes glazed over. He was shivering, disoriented, and appeared as if the weight of the world had finally caught up with him. He didn't try to run. He didn't resist. The quiet, introverted teenager who had once served drinks and cleared plates now surrendered without a fight, as though he had already given up on everything. His expression was a strange mix of exhaustion and defiance. He looked nothing like the kid who had quietly worked at the cafe, who had followed orders without complaint. Mark's face, once calm and neutral, was now filled with something darker. A sense of finality, a coldness that had overtaken the innocence that should have been there. He didn't speak as the officers approached, their hands reaching for the cuffs. There were no words of regret, no pleas for forgiveness. When asked why he did it, Mark's response was simple, almost dismissive. They didn't care. None of them did. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the officers stood in stunned silence. They had expected anger, fear, confusion, but not this. There were no tears in his eyes, no signs of remorse, no apologies. He didn't seem sorry for what he had done. He seemed detached, as if the massacre he had orchestrated was just another task he had completed, something that had to be done, like clocking out at the end of a shift. The boy who had quietly served tables and hidden in plain sight was gone. In his place stood something else entirely, a cold, hardened killer. The drive back to the station was uneventful. Mark said little, staring out the window with a blank expression. The officers in the car didn't speak either, unsure of what to make of him. They had dealt with criminals before, but there was something unsettling about Mark, his complete lack of emotion, his refusal to offer any explanation beyond his terse statement. It wasn't until they reached the station that Mark was processed, his fingerprints taken, his pictures snapped. Still, there was no sign of a breakdown, no display of fear or guilt. It was as if he had already resigned himself to whatever fate awaited him. His trial would soon become a spectacle, but the damage had already been done. 36 innocent lives had been lost, and the town of Florida would never be the same. The media descended on the case with the speed and ferocity of a wildfire. News outlets from across the country picked up the story with headlines that screamed about the Florida Café massacre. The fact that the killer was just a 17-year-old boy made the story even more chilling. How could someone so young, someone who had worked as a waiter, been capable of such horrific violence? The tragedy seemed incomprehensible, and the nation watched as the details began to emerge. Every new revelation about Mark's life, his behavior, his motives, seemed to twist the knife deeper. People couldn't understand how someone who had once been invisible could suddenly commit something so violent, so unthinkable, but there was no explanation that could make sense of it. Mark's trial was a media circus from the start. The gruesome nature of the crime, the scale of the massacre, and Mark's age all contributed to the sensation. He was too young to face the death penalty, but that did not lessen the weight of the charges against him. The prosecution filed 36 counts of first-degree murder, one for each of the victims, as well as additional charges of attempted murder, terrorism, and assault. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His fingerprints on the guns, the surveillance footage from the cafe, the eyewitness accounts of survivors. But despite the clear evidence, Mark's defense team argued that he had suffered from severe psychological issues, pointing to his troubled upbringing and the pressures of adolescence that had pushed him over the edge. They painted him as a victim of circumstances, a troubled teen who had never been given the help he needed. For weeks, the courtroom was filled with tense moments. Survivors took the stand, recounting the horror they had witnessed, their voices shaking with emotion. Some were unable to speak at all, too traumatized to relive the nightmare. The family members of the victims showed up every day, their faces a mixture of grief and disbelief. They listened as experts tried to explain Mark's behavior, some of them suggesting that his violent tendencies had been triggered by mental health issues, others proposing that he had simply been a ticking time bomb. But nothing could bring back their loved ones, and no explanation could justify the carnage that had unfolded in the cafe. The jury deliberated for what seemed like an eternity. It wasn't just a case of who was guilty, it was a case of understanding why. How could a 17-year-old boy carry out such a brutal attack? How could someone who had seemed so quiet, so ordinary, be capable of such horror? In the end, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty on all charges. Mark Jennings was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's words were heavy, and his sentence was clear, but there was no sense of closure. The families of the victims were not relieved by the verdict. Mark had taken everything from them, and nothing, not even his life in prison, could return what was lost. For Mark, the sentence was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that would see him locked away in a high-security facility, where he would be isolated from the world he had once been a part of. His name, which had once been just another face in the crowd, would now be forever associated with the massacre that had changed the town of Florida and the lives of countless people. The cafe, once a place of warmth and familiarity, would now be remembered only for the bloodshed that had occurred there. And Mark, the quiet boy who had once served meals with a smile, would be remembered as the killer who destroyed it all. Years after the massacre at the Sunset Grill, the town of Florida remained gripped by the weight of what had transpired on that fateful day. The memories of the event had become woven into the fabric of the town, impossible to erase. The cafe, once a gathering place for friends, families, and tourists alike, was eventually rebuilt, but it was never the same. The bright yellow walls and green shutters, which had once beckoned with warmth and charm, now felt hollow. The space that had once been filled with laughter, conversation, and the clinking of glasses was now silent, its walls echoing with the absence of what it had once represented. The bustling energy of the cafe had been replaced by a stillness that settled over the room like a heavy fog, leaving a permanent mark on the place. Every year, on the anniversary of the massacre, survivors and their families gathered to remember the 36 lives that were lost. They would meet at the rebuilt cafe, some of them silently holding hands, others standing alone in their grief. There were no speeches, no memorials, just the simple act of being together, as they had been on that tragic day. Some tried to speak, to share their pain. but the words often failed them. The grief was too much, too heavy to express fully. Every face was haunted by the same loss, the same questions that could never be answered. Why had it happened? Why were they still here when so many others were not? But even with the gathering, there was no closure. The town's collective wound remained open, unhealed. The years that passed did little to ease the ache that had settled into the hearts of those who had lived through the nightmare. Every anniversary brought the same sorrow, the same empty feeling of something irreparably broken. Time, they realized, didn't heal wounds. It simply made them a little more bearable until the next year, when the memories would rush back with all the same intensity. Mark Jennings' name would forever be etched in the history of Florida as the boy who turned his workplace into a killing field. It would be remembered alongside the other names of killers who had become infamous in their own right. His name would be tied to the massacre, to the moment when everything changed. He became the symbol of a tragedy too terrible to fathom, one that would not be erased by time, nor by the efforts of the town to rebuild and move forward. He was the face of evil in a place that had once been peaceful. He was a reminder of the darkness that can lie hidden beneath the surface of the most ordinary lives. But for the victims, the horror was not just about Mark's actions. It was about the destruction of something much larger. Their sense of security, the belief that a cafe, a familiar place, could be a sanctuary. Before that day, no one had ever imagined that a place so full of life could suddenly become the scene of so much death. The town, which had once been a tight-knit community, now lived with a new, unsettling truth. Nothing was truly safe. The simple, everyday places people had once trusted, restaurants, schools, parks, could all become sites of violence in an instant. That realization was the hardest to bear. It wasn't just about the people they had lost. It was about the way the world had changed overnight. The walls of the Sunset Grill, rebuilt with fresh paint and new furniture, could never fully shield them from the memory of the bloodshed that had stained the floor. The tragedy also served as a reminder of the darkness that can hide in plain sight. Mark had been a quiet, seemingly harmless teenager, a kid who blended in with the crowd, a waiter who served customers without anyone suspecting that he could commit such an unimaginable act. His quiet demeanor, his introverted nature, had made him invisible to those around him, allowing him to slip through the cracks unnoticed. The truth was that people didn't often look for darkness in the faces of those who were quiet or withdrawn. They didn't think to ask the right questions, to dig deeper into the lives of those who seemed ordinary. Mark had lived among them, a part of the fabric of the town, but no one had recognized the warning signs. No one had seen the storm brewing inside him. And when that darkness finally broke through, it shattered the illusion of safety that everyone had taken for granted. It was a reminder that sometimes evil doesn't wear a face that's easy to recognize. It doesn't always shout or scream. Sometimes it hides behind a calm exterior, waiting for the right moment to strike. The quiet ones, the ones who seem the least threatening, can harbor the most terrifying potential. The tragedy of the Sunset Grill was not just a warning about gun violence or mental health. It was a reminder that darkness can live within us all, and sometimes we are blind to it until it is too late. For the survivors, the families, and the entire town, the memory of what happened would never fade. It lingered in the air like a constant, invisible presence, something that could never be shaken off. Each year, as the anniversary came around, the grief would resurface, raw and unhealed, but life would go on. The cafe, though changed, would remain a part of the town's landscape, serving as a monument to both what had been lost and what had endured. It was a place that would never be the same. But like the town itself, it would continue to exist, carrying the weight of the past on its shoulders. The memory of the massacre, the faces of those lost, and the unanswerable questions would remain forever etched in the hearts of the people who had been touched by it.